Welcome to the AP Now podcast, the podcast that covers trends, insights, and emerging issues impacting every accounts payable function. Your host, Mary Schaeffer, is the founder of AP Now, a B2B digital information and learning company focused on all issues related to AP. Stay tuned as Mary and her guests discuss the business intelligence you need to ensure a cost-effective, technologically efficient, fraud-resistant, regulatory compliant accounts payable function. Without further ado, let's dive right in.
Welcome to episode 55 of the AP Now podcast. I'm Mary Schaeffer, and today we're going to talk about invoice games that some vendors play. And in case you can't guess, I think that these are less than honorable vendors. So let's dive right in and get started. I want to start off because we're still in the middle of the coronavirus epidemic, if you will, to say I hope everyone is safe. And let's get going. So we're going to talk about vendors today, and we're going to talk about vendors who may not operate in the way that accounts payable folks would like and who create problems for the accounts payable team. Now, many of these folks are just on the other side, the vendors. They're just looking to get paid, and they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that they get paid. But some of them, in our opinion, go a little too far. Some of them are just quite diligent in their task, and they're so focused on making sure that invoice gets paid that they don't care that they create a lot of extra work for some of their vendors, and occasionally some of their vendors might end up paying them twice. Then there are others who maybe are not as diligent, but they take some shortcuts. They take advantage of automation, and they will, send duplicate copies of invoices to their customers, some of whom have paid or who have a very good track record and don't really deserve to be getting this. But at the end of the day, they create problems. And lastly, there are what I call the outright dishonest. So let's dive right in and let's take a look at some of the games that they play, and you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. So at the beginning of this year, we did a survey of our members, and we did it concurrent with the Credit Research Foundation doing a survey of their members. And this whole effort, if you will, was coordinated by NACHA. And the goal was to ask the same questions and to see if we got the same answers. And we thought we were not going to get the same answers, and there was going to be a lot of finger pointing. But as it turns out, that was not the case. Both sides were honest and told the same story. And we asked about invoices being sent to multiple parties. Now, when we asked the AP folks, 80% of them, actually slightly over 80%, said that they were receiving multiple copies of the same invoice. They were being sent to multiple parties within their organization. And they estimated that on average, 16% of the invoices that they received were duplicates. So that meant that there's extra work for these folks. They simply have to weed out the duplicate invoices and make sure they don't pay them twice. And of course, a few of them do get paid twice. And then they have to try and get that money back, assuming that they become aware of it. So if you have vendors who are doing this, you can do a few things. Number one, you can ask them to stop. Some of them will, some of them won't. But you also need to set up good, strong processes within your accounts payable function to make sure that your vendors are being identified when they send these duplicate copies of invoices. And one last thing on this issue, if you can identify those duplicate invoices as early on in the process as possible, that will save your team the most work. Sure, it's fine if you find out after the fact that you double paid a vendor and you go and you get that money back, but better that you don't make that payment and you identify that invoice early on and you don't waste all that effort on it. The next game that some vendors play, and they've been doing this for years, to be honest, is they change the invoice number when they send that second copy of the invoice. So some of them will change it by simply adding an A or a B after the invoice number. And to them, that's their way of tracking that they got paid on the second invoice or the third invoice, etc. We wish that they wouldn't do that because it makes it a little bit harder for the accounts payable team to identify duplicate invoices because, let's face it, invoice number is one of the key ways that companies identify duplicate invoices, but it is what it is. However, there are some vendors who, when they send that second invoice, they use a completely different invoice number. Now, they claim that they're not trying to trick their customers. We could have a long discussion about whether that's true or not. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if they're going to do this. We're going to have to deal with it. And so you need to make sure you have good routines in, just as with the vendors who send duplicate invoices to different parties. You need to make sure that you can identify these as soon as possible. So once you've identified the vendors who do this, you might want to always double check their invoices to make sure that this isn't just another one of their duplicates. This next activity that I'm going to talk about, game number 3, I think is unhonorable, dishonorable, but it's going on and you should be aware of it. And this is, there's a group of consultants out there who are advising their accounts receivable customers and their treasury customers to go ahead and send a second invoice 5 days before the due date. Okay? And they claim that this is a way to improve cash flow. Sure, it improves cash flow. It improves cash flow by occasionally getting a customer to double pay. And then, of course, the customer has to find that duplicate payment and retrieve it. When you receive an invoice that's dated close to the due date, you might want to double check and make sure that you've not already have this invoice and it's not already in process to be paid. Again, identify the vendors, the suppliers who do this, and then double check everything that they send. And you might inform them, hey guys, by doing this, you're not getting paid faster, you're getting paid in a longer time because we're pulling your invoices for double checking. Maybe you want to tell them, maybe you don't. Depends upon what your relationship is. Even worse, or maybe equally bad, are those vendors who also send a duplicate copy of the invoice, but this they send on the due date. And again, this is another tactic being advocated by some consultants. And, the problem with this is even if you pay on time, it's unlikely that your vendor is going to get that cash applied immediately. So they'll send the second invoice, and then again, hopefully you'll catch it, but it will take extra work for you to catch it. So again, not a good situation. Again, double check your invoices that are received close to the due date, and then identify the suppliers who are doing this and have a little chat with them. And again, tell them, hey guys, we're going to hold your invoices. We're going to pull all your invoices for double checking, and this is going to delay payments. And hopefully they'll see the light and stop doing this. Okay, the last issue that I want to talk about has to do also with stale dated invoices. But before we start talking about that, I want to just go down memory lane, if you will, and I want to talk about all the people that we have remote working. About 18 months ago at AP Now, we did a survey about remote workers in AP. And what we found at that time is that there were a few, but very few, companies who had people who were working remotely 100% of the time. We found that about, I think it was 18% of the companies allowed employees who wanted to work remotely to do so 1 or 2 days a week. But the idea here was that they would be in the office most of the week, and then they would prepare for the stay at home, so they might scan invoices, etc. And companies who did that reported that they had a high degree of worker satisfaction and very little turnover. But we also found out that there were some people who did not like working remotely, okay? They preferred to go into the office every day. So realize that you're going to have a mix when we start talking about remote workers. Fast forward 18 months to March of 2020, and we now find ourselves dealing with the coronavirus. And we did a survey of our readers who happened to be attending a webinar on March 19th. And what we found at that point was 84% of them were working from home. 84% of the accounts payable departments were working from home. A few were still going into the office, either because their companies had not gone into quarantine or because their processes were so paper-laden that the accounts payable staff, and in fact some accounting staffs, were deemed to be essential and therefore had to go in because there was no way the organization could get their bills paid without having people go into the office. But 84% are now working from home. So That has created a problem because of a new issue that has raised its ugly head, if you will, because of the coronavirus situation, or at least that's what I think it is. Many companies experienced a serious drain on cash flow. They saw business drop 50%, 70%, 80%. And so what some of these organizations did is they had their staff go through old invoices to make sure that they were all paid and all paid completely. And so what the accounts payable team started receiving in a number of instances were stale dated invoices. And these invoices may have had disputed items on them that had been resolved, but the company was now trying once again to collect this money. This may have been due to cash flow problems, or they may just have thought, well, everybody's working at home. Nobody will be able to check this out and see if it's legitimate or not. The next thing that people have reported seeing on some of these stale dated invoices are charges that they were never supposed to pay. So, for example, now all of a sudden they're getting a freight charge from an invoice 2 years ago when the contract said clearly that freight was supposed to be picked up by the supplier, not the customer. And unfortunately, a few companies have reported that they're getting stale dated invoices that are completely phony. It's for goods that were never ordered, that they had never ordered. So, all of these invoices, all of this requires extra work because before these stale dated invoices can be paid, the company has to do research. And of course, when you're working remotely, that's not always as easy as it is when you're in the office. Now, if your activity is all in the cloud and you've been like this for a while, it's probably not so bad. But for many, it is creating a complete problem. So we say if you receive these stale dated invoices, yeah, you need to do the research to see if you owe the money, but don't feel like you have to drop everything and do it right away. Hey, they waited, 2 years to bill you. You shouldn't be expected to pay on a dime. And realize that in many cases, but not all, I want to emphasize it, not all the charges either are phony or they were things you weren't supposed to pay for, or they were disputed items that you had resolved the dispute and the agreement was that you wouldn't pay. This is another reason why good documentation is critical. So, when we step back and we look at all these issues, some of them have been with us traditionally for a while. Some of them now are rearing their ugly heads that we're in a coronavirus. What are some of the things that we can do to stop and make sure that our organization doesn't get hit with charges that we don't owe? The first one is, basically use your best practices, your strong internal controls when it comes to processing invoices. Means things like rigid coding standards and having everybody process exactly the same way. You also want to use your regular duplicate payment checking routines. This will help you identify those instances where a duplicate invoice may have been sent in and you may have paid it. Don't forget to do your statement audits and look for all those open credits, because some of those open credits are just items that you paid twice. But again, when you get those stale dated invoices, check them carefully. So check the stale dated invoices and also the invoices that show up at or right around the due date. So if the item is due May 1st and it's showing up on April 28th or it's showing up on May 2nd, you want to take a close look and make sure that it wasn't paid before you do. And lastly, if you're using invoice automation, if you have an invoice automation tool, it will help with some of these problems. It won't completely eliminate them. It's not the silver bullet that we all wish it was, but it will help with some of them. Alrighty, well, that's it for us today, talking about invoice games that some vendors will play. Hopefully they're not playing them on you. I'd like to thank you for listening today and ask that if you like this episode that you give it a thumbs up or a positive review, or you subscribe, and of course you share information about this episode with your staff and with your other contacts on social media websites such as LinkedIn, etc. And I urge you all to be safe. These are crazy times that we live in. If you want to be alerted to new episodes of this podcast as well as new frauds, sign up for a free twice-a-week e-zine. You can sign up for it at www.ap-now.com. There's a box right on the website. I hope to visit with you again on another AP Now podcast. See you then, and until then, be safe.